My name is Chris Berg and I'm the Director of Policy at the IPA and, as Rod has mentioned, author of In Defence of Freedom of Speech, From Ancient Greece to Andrew Bolt. I would especially like to extend my welcome and the welcome of the rest of the staff of the IPA, not only just to our eminent guests, but all the members and donors to the IPA. In June, one prominent human rights commentator, Professor Sarah Joseph from the Caston Law Centre, wrote that the Institute of Public Affairs has been one of the loudest advocates of free speech arguments against media regulation. Sounds great. She did not mean that as a compliment. But we're going to take it as one. Thanks to the support of our thousands of members, the IPA is very, very proud to be the loudest voice standing up for free expression in Australia. When Andrew Bolt was found to have breached Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, we immediately placed a full-page statement in The Australian explaining that the IPA and 1,261 supporters of the IPA believe that free speech needs to be protected for all Australians as well as Andrew Bolt. We started a Repeal 18C campaign to rid Australia of this illiberal law. We held a major event where leaders from both sides of politics, from Michael Kroger, an IPA board member, to Paul Howes, a relatively well-known union leader, declared their support for freedom of speech, this most vital liberty. We've hosted the Canadian journalist Mark Stein on a national tour to tell his story about being hauled up by the thought police in Canada. We commissioned a Galaxy poll that found 82% of Australians believe that the right to freedom of speech is more important than the right not to be offended. We're holding freedom of speech briefings in every Australian city to explain the threats we now face. My colleagues and I have just returned from Hobart and Launceston, where we held the first in this long series. We started a program, Freedom Watch, to uncover threats to freedom of speech and other threats to individual liberties like the freedom of association. And of course, we've distributed a copy of my book to every politician, every senior judge, and every opinion maker in the country. And as Rhoda said, we've included a copy in your show bags for today. This has been necessary, we believe, because as everybody in this room knows, the last 18 months have seen a steadily increasing series of attacks on our freedom to speak our minds. The Finkelstein Inquiry and Convergence Review have both called for enormously significant increases in the regulation of what is printed in our press and written even on the internet. Some government MPs are openly calling for a crackdown on the press simply because they do not like the criticism that is being directed towards them. The radio broadcaster Alan Jones was taken to the Australian Communications Regulator simply because he interviewed too many climate skeptics. It is not a joke. This is not a joke either. Piers Ackerman, the newspaper columnist, was taken to the Australian Press Council because he wrote in an opinion piece that the world was doing nothing on climate change. Obviously, he was wrong. Last month, the Attorney General's Department proposed a massive increase in government power over what we say and do online. The proposed data retention laws and increased internet surveillance powers are excessive and dangerous, and the IPA is going to continue to point that out. And of course, the precedent set by the Andrew Bolt case will have far-reaching consequences. That case has, in many ways, activated Section 18C, which is why the IPA believes its repeal is essential. There have been calls to regulate blogs. There have been calls to regulate what we say on Facebook and Twitter. There have even been calls to regulate the use of words like loony and provide statutory penalties for people who breach those regulations. There was a poll conducted by the Lowy Institute quite recently that had a very depressing finding. Only 60% of Australians believe that democracy is preferable to any other form of government. It actually gets worse than that. Of Australians between 18 and 29 years old, just 39% support democracy. When that Lowy poll was published, many, many people were surprised. The IPA was not. When we look at the war on freedom of speech as just one example of the attacks on our liberties, it is very clear how driven it is by a sense of paternalism. Many on the left, and I'm afraid many in government, simply do not believe we are able to judge what we read for ourselves. The Finkelstein inquiry said as much. And young people have been taught for decades that other Australians are incapable of choosing the food they can eat without, of course, the nanny state's help, or that they are incapable of looking after their own money without the assistance of government. So in our view, it's no surprise that these young people are starting to doubt the very wisdom of allowing all those idiotic Australians to vote. We are travelling down a dangerous path. The British experience offers a warning. Last week, you may have seen a 17-year-old boy was arrested at 2:45 a.m. merely for abusing a famous swimmer on Twitter. The thought police coming to your door in the middle of the night actually occurs in Britain. There is another alternative, an alternative road we could travel. The Canadian government is starting to roll back the attacks on freedom of speech that have enveloped the Western world in recent decades. Stephen Harper's government recently axed Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act. That's the equivalent of 18C, which Andrew Bolt was found to have breached last year. So the IPA is optimistic about free speech. And it is thanks to the thousands of individual members of the IPA that we can do this work. Thanks to their support that we can keep the pressure on, that we can host functions like this and remind Australians how important our basic liberties are.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank the IPA for organising today. Thanks to Tom and to Chris for their kind remarks. I acknowledge the presence of my distinguished senior colleague, George Brandis, the Shadow Attorney General, Philip Ruddock, of course, Scott MacDonald. I particularly want to acknowledge my elders and betters, John Stone, Neil Brown and Peter Coleman, all of whom have been an inspiration to me and to so many other Liberal Conservative politicians over the years. But most of all, I want to just say to all of you, this is a very important issue. There is really no more important issue because this is a foundational issue for a democratic polity such as ours. So I do welcome very much the opportunity to make this presentation. It is important and I've put my heart and soul into it. Right now, ladies and gentlemen, Australians are understandably and necessarily impressed by China, a country which has liberalised its economy without liberalising its polity, lifting several 100 million people from poverty into the middle class in a single generation, certainly is one of the great economic transformations in human history. China's success, though, need not mean that liberal democratic freedoms are merely an optional extra for countries that take nation building seriously. The communications revolution is affecting China no less than everywhere else, despite official misgivings. The blogosphere and tweeting could soon give even China the question everything mindset that has been so important to other countries' creativity and weight in the wider world. Then, of course, there's India, which has achieved a scarcely less remarkable economic transformation while largely preserving democracy, the rule of law and freedom of speech. 2 decades after Francis Fukuyama jumped the gun to proclaim the end of history and the triumph of liberal democracy, it would be equally presumptuous to conclude that Western civilization's moment has largely passed. History's lesson is still that countries are stronger, as well as better, with democratic freedoms than without them. Freedom of speech is not just an academic nicety, but the essential precondition for any kind of progress. A child learns by trial and error. A society advances when people can discuss what works and what doesn't. To the extent that alternatives can't be discussed, people are tethered to the status quo, regardless of its effectiveness. Freedom of speech can't be absolute. A persuasive case can be made to limit people's freedom to publish material that might breach national security, prejudice a fair trial, or deliberately mislead consumers about a particular product. But there is no case, none whatsoever, to limit debate about the performance of national leaders. The more powerful people are, the more important the presumption must be that less powerful people should be able to say exactly what they think of them. Parliamentary speeches have always been privileged against defamation suits because it has been taken for granted that MPs had to be absolutely unmuzzled if Parliament was to do its job. On matters of the greatest moment, all that should ever gag individual MPs is their own judgment. They should face criticism, censure, loss of office and electoral defeat if they misuse their freedom, but they should never be legally constrained from expressing what they think the national interest demands. Freedom of speech is an essential foundation of democracy. Without free speech, free debate is impossible, and without free debate, the democratic process cannot work properly, nor can misgovernment and corruption be fully exposed. It's part of the compact between citizen and society on which democratic government rests. A threat to citizens' freedom of speech is more than an error of political judgment. It reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of the give and take between government and citizen on which a peaceful and harmonious society is based. At an even deeper level, free speech is essential to human integrity. It enables us to express who we are and what we believe. Freedom of speech empowers Christians, Muslims, Jews, atheists, environmentalists, climate change skeptics, conservatives, socialists, gays, Gen Ys and Gen Xers, baby boomers, veterans, indeed everyone and anyone, publicly to affirm whatever it is that is important to their identity and sense of self. They can do so free from fear of a knock on the door in the middle of the night or a subpoena from a tribunal in the middle of the day. Now, it's human nature to support free speech only as long as it's agreeable, but the trouble is deciding which opinions can be censored. The danger is that a government which can censor a free press is more than capable of censoring a free people. Now, the price of free speech, which we must be prepared to pay, is that offence will be given, facts will be misrepresented, and sometimes lies will be told. Truth, after all, only emerges from such a process. But thanks to free speech, error can be exposed, corruption revealed, arrogance deflated, mistakes corrected, the right upheld, and truth flaunted in the face of power. On the issues of value, purpose and meaning, there is no committee, however expert, and no appointee, however eminent, with judgment superior to that of the whole community, which is why the best decisions are made with free debate rather than without it. Free speech can be restrained, but only at the margins and only in order to secure other important rights. As my colleague George Brandis has noted, there are exceptions to this rule, but never counterweights. Certainly, free speech shouldn't be restrained just to prevent hurt feelings, and it should never be restrained in order to protect poor performance. Now this, ladies and gentlemen, might normally be regarded as a statement of the obvious. Imagine the reaction, for instance, had the Howard government sought to gag naval personnel after children overboard. But the principle of free speech badly needs reaffirmation now because of the current government's attempts to bully critics into silence. When roof bats routinely catch fire, damaging hundreds of homes and killing 4 installers, when $16 billion has been spent building school halls that could normally have been constructed for less than half the price, when more than $50 billion is being spent on a nationalised broadband network that the government originally claimed could be done for a tenth the cost, when more than 20,000 illegal boat people have arrived because the government assumed there was no longer a problem and dropped the policy that worked, when a carbon tax that the Prime Minister said would never happen has been introduced to save her political hide, when a well-respected Speaker of the Parliament has been forced to resign to protect the government's parliamentary numbers, and when the system of justice seems incapable of dealing swiftly with an MP who's clearly ripped off union members, the ability to be critical of the government is more important than ever. Yet instead of ruefully conceding that criticism under these circumstances is only a fair cop, likely to spur better performance, the current government's response has been thinly veiled intimidation of critics masquerading as proposals for better regulation. Instead of mounting a better argument, this government's inclination is to disqualify its critics. Its instinctive response to criticism is to bully people rather than to reason with them. This is not a government that argues its case. Mostly, it simply howls down its critics using the megaphone of incumbency. There's the jihad against mining magnates for daring to question the government's investment-sapping mining tax. There's the claim that Gina Rinehart is a danger to democracy because she dared to buy an interest in a newspaper group and refused to endorse the Fairfax Group's existing editorial culture. There's the assault on mum and dad anti-carbon tax protesters in Canberra as the convoy of no consequence, or even the convoy of incontinence. The ferocity of this government's return of service often goes way beyond reasonable counter-argument to become a form of state-sponsored bullying. Late last year, Communications Minister Stephen Conroy accused the Sydney Daily Telegraph of a deliberate campaign to bring the government down. The Prime Minister had a screaming match with former News Limited boss John Hartigan over an article about her prior to entering Parliament dealings with a union official. The government's Green allies have been consistently critical of those whom ex-Senator Bob Brown tagged the hate media. The Prime Minister personally insisted that News Limited in Australia had questions to answer in the wake of the UK phone hacking scandal, even though she was not able to specify what these might be. It seems obvious that her real concern was not Fleet Street-style illegality, but News Limited's coverage of her government and its various broken promises, new taxes and botched programs. Now, to Justice Ray Finkelstein's credit, there's no specific Get News Limited vendetta evident in the report of his independent inquiry into the media and media regulation. Still, his recommendation that a powerful news media council should set journalistic standards, enforce news standards, and have power to require a news media outlet to publish an apology, correction or retraction looks like an attempt to warn off News Limited from pursuing anti-government stories. The community, industry and professional representatives that Finkelstein wants appointed to the new regulator are unlikely to be truly independent of the government that will fund it. We know the current government's attitude to tough reporting from people such as Steve Lewis and Kate McClymont because it is so constantly complaining about it. Perhaps the most shameless example was Senator Doug Cameron accusing the Murdoch press, as he calls them, of actually fabricating stories about the prospect of a Rudd challenge, for which he was himself one of the numbers men. Especially in the hands of the current government, any new watchdog could become a political correctness enforcement agency destined to suppress inconvenient truths and to hound from the media people whose opinions might rattle Philip Adams' listeners. It's easy to imagine the fate of Andrew Bolt or Alan Jones, for instance, at the hands of such thought police. Their demise, you understand, wouldn't be because the government didn't like them, but because they'd persistently breached so-called standards. Now, in response to a strongly worded critique of the Finkelstein recommendations, the government has just replied to 7 media CEOs, saying that it might not proceed with the new regulator if the media were to establish more effective forms of self-regulation. In other words, censor yourselves or we will do it for you. Any government that demands changed behaviour from the media under circumstances like these is not trying to raise journalistic standards but to lower them, to the long-term detriment of our country. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Coalition rejects the Finkelstein proposals and calls on the government to do likewise. The Coalition opposes any coercion towards greater self-regulation and calls on the government to repudiate it. The Coalition rejects calls for the introduction of a public interest test or any other suitability test for those with a stake in our media and calls on the government to do likewise. Australia does not need more regulation of the mainstream media, but we do need a new debate about freedom of speech because it's important for the current government to reveal its true colours. So far, a hung parliament hasn't made this government more responsive. Instead, the constant struggle to survive has brought out its authoritarian streak. It is not, repeat, not the role of government to manage the day-to-day practices of journalism, to dictate who can and who can't control Australian media outlets, or to score media coverage against unavoidably subjective standards of fairness. The job of government is to foster free speech, not stifle it. It's to increase the number and the range of people who can participate in public debate, not reduce it. Additional regulation is one current threat to free speech in Australia. Another, ladies and gentlemen, is the operation of Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, which prohibits statements that offend, insult, humiliate or intimidate a person or a group of people on grounds of race or ethnicity. At the time of its introduction, oblivious to the Orwellian overtones, the then Minister Nick Bolkus said that this provision was designed to prohibit speech crime over and above the traditional tort of defamation. Making the likelihood of causing offence to a group the test of acceptable behaviour goes way beyond the time-honoured remedy when a particular victim has been brought into hatred, ridicule or contempt. So let's be clear. Insulting, humiliating or intimidating others on any grounds is deplorable. It should be everyone's goal to elevate the standards of public debate, not lower them, and to demonstrate respect rather than disdain for the various components of our community. Still, a hurt feelings test is impossible to comply with while maintaining the fearless pursuit of truth, which should be the hallmark of a society such as ours. As Sir Robert Menzies declared in one of his Forgotten People broadcasts, the whole essence of freedom of speech is that it is freedom for others as well as for ourselves. It is a conception which is not born with us, but which we must painfully acquire. Most of us have no instinct at all to preserve the right of the other fellow to think what he likes about our beliefs and to say what he likes about our opinions. But if truth is to emerge and in the long run be triumphant, the process of free debate, the untrammelled clash of opinion, must go on. So, ladies and gentlemen, the article for which Andrew Bolt was prosecuted was almost certainly not his finest. There may have been some factual errors. Still, if free speech is to mean anything, It's others' right to say what you don't like, not just what you do. It's the freedom to write badly and rudely. It's the freedom to be obnoxious and objectionable. Because free speech is not bland speech. Often it's pretty rough speech, because people are entitled to be passionate when they are arguing for what they believe to be important and necessary. Speech that has to be inoffensive would be unerringly politically correct, but it would not be free. So if it's all right for David Marr, for instance, to upset conservative Christians in his attempt to have them see the error of their ways, why is it not all right for Andrew Bolt to upset activist Aboriginals to the same end? The rallying cry which we've already heard, attributed to Voltaire, "I disapprove of what you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it," should have been invoked to defend Bolt, no less than it has been to justify robust speech from different points in the philosophical compass. So let me assure you, the Coalition will repeal Section 18C in its current form. Any prohibitions on inciting hatred against or intimidation of particular racial groups should be akin to the ancient common law offences of incitement and causing fear. Expression or advocacy should never be unlawful because it is offensive. It ought to be inconceivable that a commentator offering an opinion should fall foul of the law rather than of a wave of criticism. And this is not a matter of agreeing or disagreeing with Bolt. It's a matter of an expansive or repressive view of the right to free speech. Ladies and gentlemen, it won't just be the current government that the debate over new restrictions on free speech will test. It will be all the commentators and organisations that have ever thundered in defence of free speech, but find their indignation highly selective when it's their commercial rivals or philosophical opponents who are in the dock. The Australian left has long cited the Menzies government attempt to ban the Communist Party as an egregious assault on freedom. What then will they make of any Gillard government attempt to restrict freedom of speech? Menzies, it has to be said, sought to restrict freedom in order to defend the country. The Gillard government, by contrast, seeks to restrict freedom in order to defend itself. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Coalition is often tagged the conservative side of politics, and John Howard has rightly pointed out that the Liberal Party in this country is the political representative of both the Liberal and the Conservative traditions. But essentially, we are the Freedom Party. We stand for the freedoms. We stand for the freedoms which Australians have a right to expect and which governments have a duty to uphold. We stand for freedom and will be freedom's bulwark against the encroachments of an unworthy and dishonourable government. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. The quality of our polity ultimately depends on the strength and the quality of our citizenry, and I think we have it in us to ensure that freedom of speech is no further threatened in this country.